better to have money and problems as opposed to just having problems. Hello again. Welcome to the Ruthless Truth. I am your host, Truth Davis. And in this forum, we discuss a variety of topics based on what I consider to be my unique life experience. Those topics, however, will not include sports or politics because you can pretty much get that anywhere. And as far as my unique life experience, you can read my bio in the notes. Okay. Couple announcements. Website launched this week. This is the early version of it. Still has some tweaks and improvements to make over the next couple of weeks, but I was getting traffic to the website and got tired of just seeing coming soon. So we launched, a functional version, but you'll see updates to that over time. And of course, you can still interact, leave comments, share, or like on social media at TruthDavis5 for Instagram or Ruthless Truth on Facebook. Okay, so, I read a lot of news. I don't watch a lot of news or listen to a lot of news because I grow weary of the clear biases like in TV news. The panel debates, the grandstanding, the hot takes. TV and radio news has gotten to a point where it's more about entertainment than information sharing. But however or wherever you get your news, there does seem to be one subject, apparently, that just, will not go away. And that's transgender people. And all I want to know is why? Why? Why does such an insignificantly small segment of the population get so much coverage? Estimates vary as to the size of the transgender population. I reviewed many studies, and if you take even the most bullish estimate, it comes to less than 1% of the U.S. population identifies as transgender. So how could such a small group become a problem? Well, a lot of people will point to sports, and they will point to the issue of boys competing in girls' sports. And, I live in Georgia, and in our most recent U.S. Senate race, one of the candidates made this a big part of his platform. Herschel Walker made this part of his platform and his advertising message, which was the promise to keep boys from playing girls' sports. Okay? Now, before we go any further on this, I do need to say this. I personally don't believe that people who are male at birth should be allowed to compete in female sports. And I don't think it should be seen as a controversial or bigoted statement to just acknowledge boys are physically stronger than girls. That's biology. That's science. And such a person would have an unfair advantage. But again, is this really an issue? A few months ago, there was a congressional hearing on transgender athletes in sports. We're having congressional hearings on this. And in this hearing, NCAA President Charlie Baker was asked a few questions. And one of the questions was, what is the total number of athletes in the NCAA? He's like, about 55,000. Okay. And out of those 55,000 student athletes, how many are transgender? Fewer than 10. I'm sorry, did you say 10? No, fewer than 10. It's a non-issue. And I guess one last point, how many of you have actually knowingly met a trans person? How has this even impacted you at any point? I say knowingly because I live in Atlanta and sometimes you just don't know. Okay, let's get to today's truth. Today's truth is maybe briefer than some previous episodes and maybe not as filled with drama. I don't have, a really saucy example from work, but I think it's a serious topic and I want to give it a little time and discussion. So today's truth I want to talk about money and happiness. Okay? There's a very, very old saying that money can't buy you happiness. And there are many humorous retorts to that statement, like, well, you have to have money to know that. Or, well, that's just what rich people say to poor people to keep the poor people from rioting. Now, we can debate this premise forever, but here's a fact. Rich people are happier. Okay, so let me first address all the objections and exceptions that people can come up with, because everybody knows some middle class or lower middle class people who are extremely happy. And of course, we know there are many miserable rich people. We see them on the news all the time. So of course, you can always find exceptions. I mean, like if I said most men are under 6 feet, there would be people going, oh, what are you talking about? Look at the NBA. Hell, I know lots of men over 6 feet. No, you don't. The reason you don't, because only 15% of U.S. men are 6 feet or taller, and only 3% are 6'2". So I'm not saying all rich people are happy, but the data is empirical. Overall, rich people consistently report higher levels of happiness. Now, to be able to continue this discussion, we need to get clear on the two principal terms here. What's the definition of rich? And what's the definition of happiness or happy? So let's do rich first. When I say rich, I really mean wealthy. And there's a little bit of a distinction between the two. When people talk about rich, it's generally associated with income. Okay? If you're in the top 5% of wage earners, you earn more than $350,000 a year. And to reach the top 1%, you'd have to have an income exceeding $550,000 a year. So if you're at that level and you're bringing home, $35,000 a month, you probably can comfortably pay your bills and have money left over for purchases and experiences. But if you also have a lot of debt, such as a big mortgage or car loans or credit card balances, you may not be as secure as you want to be. Because if you lose that high paying job and you're unable to replace that income, you may need to make some changes or downsize. But when I talk about wealth, now I'm talking about net worth, which is simply your total assets minus the total of your liabilities. So a person could have low to no income and still be very wealthy. For example, you could have a retiree with $4 million of assets and no debt. And that would place them in the top 2% of wealthy Americans. And also when we're talking about wealthy, I want to be clear, we're talking about millionaires, not billionaires. I know billionaires get a lot of coverage in the media and all the impact and everything about billionaires. But you got to understand, there are only 3,000 billionaires on the entire planet, of about 8.5 billion people. And of that 3,000, about 900 of them are in the United States. And within that, if you want to get to black billionaires, there are only 13 in the entire country. So we're not talking about billionaires, we're talking about millionaires. Okay. So how did these millionaires become wealthy? Well, inheritance? No. Only 21% received an inheritance of any kind. And only 3% of them received an inheritance of $1 million or more. So then it must be corporate America, corporate executives. Not really. Because while reaching the corporate executive ranks often leads to wealth, that group only represents about 15% of the millionaires. So then you go entertainment, sports, lottery winners, that entire group together, that's like 2%. Okay. So where does wealth come from? Most wealth is generated by regular people working hard, saving, experiencing some modest income increases over time, living below their means, and investing wisely. And then you may be thinking, well, I don't have one of those high-paying jobs that provides enough income for me to save a lot. Again, no, that's likely not true. Because here are the top 5 professions, occupations, as a percentage of millionaires. All right. Engineer, accountant, teacher, management, attorney. Those 5 professions represent more millionaires than any other professions in the country. I know it's not exciting or sexy, but that's how wealth is built. Look, I enjoy social media as much as the next person. And like most people, I probably spend more time on social media than I should. And this time spent can also generate a sense of FOMO, fear of missing out. Because if you look at social media, it feels like everybody's having a great time. Everybody's living a lavish lifestyle. Everybody's spending money. But let me say this to the millennials and the Gen Z listeners out there. Please, please know this. There are very, very few millionaires in this country under the age of 40. Very few. And when I say very few, specifically, the number is 6%. Okay? That's a fact. So just because you see someone spending a lot of money, it doesn't mean they have a lot of money to spend. I remember we once had a next door neighbor who was a former Major League Baseball player. We'll call him John. And he played 10 years in the big leagues. And then several years after that, he was a Major League Baseball coach. And my oldest son thought like this was like the richest person he had ever met, maybe the first rich person he had ever met. And he just thought he was living the life because he saw how he lived. He saw that John had his dry cleaning picked up and delivered, the same for the detailing of his luxury cars, of which he had several. Additionally, he had multiple homes. He had homes in Atlanta, Miami, Chicago, and perhaps another place. So my son would say to me like, wow, Mr. John, he's really balling. And I said, he's really rich. And I said, well, we don't know if he's rich. We just know he spends a lot of money. And my son was like, well, don't you have to have a lot of money to spend a lot of money? And I'm like, not necessarily. Because at that time, I was also president of the Homeowners Association. And I knew that John was not paying his HOA dues. And additionally, a year later, his house went into foreclosure due to delinquent mortgage payments. So the lesson there, don't assume the people you see spending money really have money to spend. So you're probably not missing out on much. Okay, so now to happiness. Happiness, much trickier, much more complicated topic. With wealth, it's fairly straightforward. If I ask you, what will it take to take you from middle class to wealthy? Your answer would be simple. Well, just give me more money. Okay, got it. But if the question is, what would need to change in your life for you to be happy? Okay, many people would struggle with that question. And there are a couple of primary reasons why that's tough. One, happiness is subjective. And what makes a person happy varies greatly by person. For instance, some people would find joy in living in a rustic cabin in the country or mountains, isolated from civilization. For me, that would be hell on earth. I have a really close friend. We've been friends since childhood, and he's always trying to get me to go camping, and I always say no. And what I tell him is, camping for me is a hotel without room service. Now, I know that may make me sound like a high maintenance little bitch, but when it comes to travel, I kind of am. I mean, I don't spend a lot of money on cars. I don't spend a lot of money on clothes and jewelry or accessories. But when I travel, I want to be comfortable. So just gets to my point. Different things matter more to different people. The second factor is much more challenging and somewhat surprising. Many people just don't know. I mean, they really don't know what will make them happy. And if you ask them what will make you happy, they don't know. But there's been enough study on this subject, and there's been enough interviews that there are a few fairly common, reliable, consistent factors that most people There are always exceptions, but most people would associate with happiness, and they are strong relationships. And that can be with your kids, with your spouse, with your parents, with your friends, but just, support group of relationships, a sense of purpose, meaningful work or activities, having a reason to get up in the morning and do something that you enjoy or you want to do. Having fun or enjoyable life experiences. And obviously that varies, back to my cabin example or camping example, but however that person defines fun and enjoyable. Good health, good health, definitely. And then last but definitely not least, lack of stress. Most people who have some or all of those factors in their life are probably happier more than not. But I really want to focus on the last item of the list I just covered, which was lack of stress. Lack of stress. Now, I realize there are multiple reasons and sources for stress, but it should not surprise you to hear that a leading source of stress is financial worry. What if I lose my job? What if I need major home repairs and they aren't covered by insurance? How am I going to take care of my kids? What if they want to go to college? How am I going to pay for it? Or if my parents get old and aging and sick, how will I care for them? What if my car breaks down and I have major repairs, or even worse, I've got to get a new car? What if I get sick or injured or disabled? Those are all financial worries that bring stress to the table. Gallup just completed, when I say just completed, April 2025, just completed a poll, and they asked a large sample of Americans to list their top 5 financial concerns. Okay? People have many, but these were the top 5. Inflation and the cost of living, housing costs, and that's everything associated, not just mortgage and rent, but repair and upkeep, having insufficient income or savings. This will surprise me a little bit. Stock market performance and retirement, which are often linked together because people save at work, and then healthcare costs, which is not surprising. So those are your top 5 financial worries. And when you have financial worries, you have stress. Those are all legitimate financial concerns, and many households stress over this regularly, if not daily. But what if you didn't have to spend even a second worrying about any of these things? Wouldn't life be easier? Wouldn't you be happier? Let me talk a little bit more about how wealth impacts people. Most people think the best parts about wealth are material, living in big houses, the purchase of luxury goods, maybe, high-end travel. And don't get me wrong, those things are real and those things are nice, but they're occasional, okay? The real joy and happiness of wealth is daily life. It's the little things in daily life. It's the things that you never have to think about, much less worry about. It's the freedom to be wasteful. One example, I'm a foodie. I will tell you, I love eating out. I like going to nice restaurants. And sometimes when you're at a restaurant and there are a lot of great choices and you can't decide, let's say you can't decide between the steak and the sea bass, hell, a rich person could say, you know what, I'll just order both. And I can eat half of each and take the rest home, or maybe just eat half of each and leave it and walk away. But they don't think about it. They don't have pricing going into the decisions of what they're going to do to enjoy. There are entire categories of products that rich people just don't buy. Home warranties, car warranties, life insurance, long-term health insurance, college saving plans, student loans. That is a whole category of products that a lot of people are in that rich people don't buy. Because most of the people buy these products as protection against a large, unexpected expense that would be difficult to pay. 50% of U.S. households, if presented with an unexpected $500 expense, would struggle to pay that expense. Okay? You got your budget, you got social spending for it, and all of a sudden, bam, $500 shows. 50% of households would struggle to come up with that $500. The reason people have home warranties is because, if I need a new refrigerator, if the refrigerator breaks down, I don't have the money just to go out and pay a refrigerator. Rich people don't worry about that because they're like, if it breaks down, then I'll just buy a new refrigerator. Many people are worried today about a possible recession and soaring prices and what that means. And we're seeing it already. They're cutting back on spending. They might be delaying the annual family vacation, or maybe they're just worried about the new budget bill that's, out of Congress and in Senate right now for consideration, and what the potential cuts may be to Social Security or Medicaid or Medicare and other services. And you see all that? Rich people don't worry about that at all. That never crosses into their consideration. And they will make no changes in their spending habits, regardless of the outcome of these situations. So if you're in a situation where prices or inflation don't affect you, then when you're shopping, you only have to consider what you want versus getting into price comparison, price shopping. Okay. I think I've made my point, or I hope I've made my point of some of the ways that rich people have less financial worry, less stress, ergo are happier. Now, I know that many people will continue to say money doesn't buy happiness, and I actually believe that as well, because rich people do have problems too. And so I'll quote that great life philosopher, Pee Wee Herman. In the 1980s, Pee Wee Herman exploded onto the celebrity scene. He had a hit children's TV show on Saturday mornings, and he had a couple of popular movies. And so at the height of his fame, he was doing an interview and he was asked, hey, how are you dealing with all the problems that have come with your newfound fame? And I'll never forget his reply. He said, it appears to me that it's better to have money and problems as opposed to just having problems. Okay? So, a few summary points before we move off of this. First, even though I've talked a lot about how wealth can make your life easier and wealth can help get happiness, please don't make acquiring wealth the biggest priority in your life. If you go back to my initial list of the factors that make people happy, relationships, having a sense of purpose, doing something you like to do, all those things are non-monetary, okay? That said, if one of your priorities, not your major priority, but if one of your priorities is to truly accumulate wealth, that's fine. I'm never going to criticize people for saying, I want to have more money. But you need to recognize, first, it usually takes decades to achieve. So don't get impatient, all right? And second, don't forget to enjoy the journey along the way. That are some of the most enjoyable pieces of life, each life phase and what you go through. And there's a certain, believe it or not, satisfaction from struggling with something and then overcoming it and moving on. Those are the things, that makes life great. And finally, again, if gaining wealth is a goal, then you need a plan. Because it doesn't just happen, okay? Think about it. Write down how you're going to live, save, and invest, because that's your best path to getting there. Okay, let's get to today's U.S. fun fact, and it's a good one. I really like this. I want to tell you the story of Nathan Green, okay? Nathan Green was born into slavery in 1820. And his owner was actually a company called Landis and Green. And what they would do is they would lend out young Nathan for a fee. People could hire him to come do stuff. Somewhere around the mid 1850s, he began working on a farm in Lincoln County, Tennessee. And the farm was owned by a man named Dan Call. Dan was most known as a preacher, but he was also a grocer and a whiskey distiller. Now, there are some of his neighbors had trouble reconciling how can you be a preacher and also distill whiskey, but, he got through that. It was 1850s. Nathan Green worked for Dan Call and developed into a master distiller. And he specialized in a process that gave his whiskey a unique smoothness known as sugar maple charcoal filtering. And it wasn't long before it was clear to everybody around that Nathan, also known as Nearest, was the best distiller in the area. So, also around that time, a young white boy came to work for Mr. Call. His name was Jasper, and he was the 10th child in his family and had pretty rough time. His mom died when he was an infant. His dad was struggling to care for all the kids. So young Nathan had come in to work for Mr. Call as a farmhand. And he performed basic farmhand duties, slapping pigs, milking cows, just generally assignments, cleaning up around the area. But he was a curious kid. And over time, he wanted to learn more about that part of the farm where he would see big black smoke going into the air. And there was a lot of activity as far as mules and wagons coming and going. And he asked Mr. Call, what is that about? So one day, Mr. Call introduced Jasper to Nathan. And he said, this is Uncle Nearest. He is the best whiskey maker I know of. And then he asked Nearest to teach the young boy everything he knew about distilling, and especially his process of sugar, maple, charcoal filtering. Well, in addition to learning everything about distilling, Jasper discovered, he was a pretty good salesperson too. He left Mr. Call and started selling whiskey around the area. And his whiskey was especially popular with Civil War soldiers. During the war, at the age of 15, his father passed away, and then Jasper became an orphan. And he decided then that he was going to make his living selling whiskey, and so he partnered with Mr. Call. Mr. Call liked it because, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of his congregation had problems with him distilling whiskey, so he was able to bring in Jasper to really run that. And then when the war ended, and Nathan Green became a free man and he was emancipated, then Jasper asked Nathan to join him in the company as, not a slave, but as a paid master distiller. So business thrived. And Jasper went on to become the most successful and best known whiskey maker in the world. Now, around Lynchburg, Jasper was known as Uncle Jack, but to the rest of the world, his name was Jack Daniels. Okay? The distillery thrived, and Jack needed to relocate the company to a place to be able to carry on bigger operations. Well, Uncle Nearest was getting older at that time, so he retired, and he did not move with Jack to the new location. But Nearest's sons and his grandsons continued to work at Jack Daniels. Now, this story of Uncle Nearest and Jack Daniels went unknown and untold for over 160 years. This story didn't really come to light until a New York Times article, an investigative reporter, reported on it in 2016. And then from there, things really changed. In 2017, Uncle Nearest Inc. was formed, and they launched the Uncle Nearest Premium Brand Whiskey. Then that was in 2017. In 2019, Uncle Nearest announced that Victoria Butler, a direct descendant of Nathan Green, would become the master blender. And she became the first known African-American female whiskey master blender. And she was great. She was Master Blender of the Year by Whiskey Magazine and the Spirit Business in 2021. And she became whiskey's first back-to-back winner in 2022. Uncle Nearest Inc. is headquartered in Shelbyville, Tennessee. Actually, my mom's hometown. The distillery is open for tours and visit, and it boasts the longest bar in the world. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, this is no baseless boast. I have personally sat at the longest bar in the world, and you just have to see it to believe it. And the food is really good too. Shelbyville is about an hour outside of Nashville. So if you ever get the chance, I highly recommend you visit the Uncle Nearest Distillery. Okay, that's all for today on the Ruthless Truth. Again, check out the website, truthdavis.com, and all the social media at Instagram, truthdavis5, and Facebook, Ruthless Truth. And I will see you all next time.